Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and anything related to those issues. Today I'm continuing on my series on helping the apologist. I think this is part 8. And in this one I am dealing with the ontological argument because that's what we voted for this week. You guys are trolling me, right? You're trolling me because I hate this argument. I just hate it. It's, well, kind of absurd. But, well, let's give it some fairness, okay? Basically the argument goes like this. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. A maximally great being exists in some world, possible world. And if a maximally great being exists in some possible, then it exists in every possible world. And if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, therefore a maximally great being exists. The maximally great being God. Oh boy. The understanding of a maximally great being is where I have the first problem. Because when you begin to get the definition of a maximally great being is, as I think William Lane Craig defines it, is one who is all-powerful, all-knowing, is morally perfect, and exists in every world. And this is kind of the first problem that I have with the argument, because most of those things are logically inconsistent. For instance, what do you mean by all-powerful? Can a God make a rock that he can't lift? If he can't make a rock that he can't lift, then he's not all-powerful, and if he can't lift the rock, then he's also not all-powerful. What do you mean by all-knowledge? What do you mean by all-knowing? Does God know things absolutely as far as the future, or does he know things propositionally? What is it possible for God to do? What is it possible for God to know? And what do we mean by morally perfect? There seems to be some debate about whether morals should be objective or subjective, or what exactly is meant by moral perfect. Notice that the more modern rendition gets rid of the idea of God being all-loving, because that creates the problem of evil problem. And so a lot of these people are going to this idea of maximally great being. Basically, those that are still following the ontological argument is, well, first of all, it's a very small number of people that still believe in this argument. Heck, most Christians, including some famous ones like Thomas Aquinas and several others, dismissed this argument as nonsense. In fact, a contemporary of Anselm, who created this argument, also dismissed it by grading an abductio absurdum, which basically made it absurd. He illustrated the absurdity of the argument by being absurd with it. And so there's a lot of things that are against this argument right away. A lot of Christians don't even believe it. But the big issue at this point about what do we mean by maximally great being, that protects the idea of all-powerful, morally perfect, because a maximally great being can be debated as to what the specific definition of that is. One of the chief problems, for instance, with the moral argument is nobody seems to want to define what God is. Which God are we talking about? What is the nature of this God, and how does that nature connect to, the nature of the necessity of objective morality? In this one, we're saying, what is objectively moral about this God? What is his perfection? How is his morality perfect? And how is he all-powerful? How is he all-knowing? And there's really no way to get around a lot of these problems because they're contradictory or they cause massive problems. The fact is, the classic definition of God is kind of, well, absurd. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit more about how theology as a discipline is absurd because of this, but I wanted to understand the ontological argument in the sense that Anselm is saying if we can conceive this great maximal being in into existence, and that it's possible for him to exist in one possible world, then he has to exist in all possible worlds, because a maximally great being would exist in all possible worlds. So he must exist in the actual world, and therefore God exists. Therefore this maximally great being exists. Now, the real problem, of course, William Lane Craig will, in his little video, which I'll link in the description, says that 2 through 6 are non-controversial. Well, that's completely not true. Mostly because this idea of maximally great being is, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by this? And it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like, I can take all-powerful. The way I got around this as a theologian was, it's interesting how much time I spent engaged in theology that seemed to be trying to get around the problems of the ontological argument. Okay, and one of those problems is, what do you mean by all-powerful? What is that? What makes that maximally great? It becomes the question. Because if God cannot create a rock that he can't lift, then he's not all-powerful. But then again, I would probably say, as a theologian back in the day, I would have said, does that power exist? I would say that a maximally great being would have all power that actually exists. Okay, so there are certain powers that just don't exist, like making a rock that you can't lift, or so on and so forth. There are simply certain powers that God does not possess because as a power, they don't exist. They might be imaginary, but they're not real. Okay, and that was one way of getting around that problem. As far as the all-knowing part, as an open theist, I could say that God has some of his foreknowledge is, objective in the fact that it's unalterable and unchangeable, but within that is this basically conditional knowledge, which is, okay, God can see if A happens, then B is going to happen. If C happens, then D is going to happen. And A, B, and C, or whatever the choices are actually free will open to being chosen by free will beings. And so God can see all the possibilities of the future, which makes his knowledge even greater, by the way, from an open theist point of view. But he doesn't know specifically which one is going to be taken until the free will person gets to that point of decision. And so God basically has, all knowledge that can be actually known, and and known in the way that it can be known. And all of that kind of pulls back God, doesn't it? It makes him a little bit less than this maximal perfect being. And so in order to get around the maximal perfect being problems, you have to kind of pull God back and make him lesser. The same is true with morality. What do we mean by perfect morality? Even on the argument for God from a moral point of view, we had this disagreement about which is superior of subjective or objective morality, which one is more real. Is morality objective or subjective? And so it becomes a real difficult proposition to point out that this does not necessarily compute. There are certain things, like even with the ontological argument, people acknowledge, like a married bachelor is an impossibility. So what part of this moral being is an actual impossibility? Well, I think it's impossible for some of the traits that classic theology gives to God in the first place. And you get rid of the ontological argument basically by saying, what is, your definition of what this means is logically incoherent. Much like a married bachelor, a lot of these things just don't work and don't go together. It's interesting how many Christians and how many people who believe in God discard this argument because they say it's ridiculous too. So there's a very small number of people that still hold to the ontological argument, and they have a lot of problems with it. The basic issue, of course, is that it begs the question. That's the basic logical fallacy it does. Apologia, in his video on the ontological argument, because he takes on William Lane Craig's version of it, and I'll put it up here so you can see it, he basically substitutes an actually great being with being that exists, and you get the same argument. So in short, anything that could exist in any possible world exists in actuality. Well, somehow that doesn't make sense anymore, does it? There are some things that just don't exist. They're just products of imagination. And so this kind of fails all the way along the line. I always love the illustrations that people use to show how absurd this is by doing abducting absurdum, or illustrating absurdity by being absurd with it. Because you can have a maximally great pizza, you can have a maximally great unicorn, you can have a maximally great leprechaun, and you can really do this with just about anything that you think should or might exist. Anything that we can imagine, we can put in this argument and suddenly make it exist based on the argument. It's magic. Poof. Leprechauns exist. Because in a maximally great universe, there would be a maximally great leprechaun. And we can conceive the concepts of behind the magically delicious leprechaun, then bam, he must exist in some possible world, so therefore he exists in all possible worlds, and he must exist in the actual world. You see how absurd this gets pretty quickly? It kind of goes away at that point, and I just don't have a lot of truck with it. Now, as promised, I'm going to talk to you about why theology then is absurd. Because the vast majority of time when I was engaged in theology, theology is attempting to make the ontological argument work on a regular basis. The vast majority of theology is trying to figure out this all-powerful, all-knowing, what is God's morality and character, what is the kind of world that he developed and why did he do it. And so all those questions of the maximally great being, that's what theology always is attempting to answer, okay? And because I think this argument now is absurd, the exercise of theology is engaged in trying to find an object that is absurd in its nature. We either have to reconceive God entirely, which I don't think anybody's going to do, or we're going to have to show that basically theology is an absurd act. I spent a lot of time, as I talked about before, as an open theist, trying to answer the question of what does it mean for God to know? And I would say, well, my definition of knowledge became God knows what actually exists in the way that it is knowable, okay? That he knows exactly what's going on. So God would know some things absolutely and other things propositionally in order to maintain relationship and free will of his creatures. Thus, I'm trying to protect the free will defense as well with that theology. Isn't it interesting that how much of theology is done to protect these philosophical arguments for the existence of God? And the ontological argument is probably the best example of that, because this is an absurd argument. You can literally throw anything in this maximally great being and have it there. And so basically what you're dealing with then is trying, in theology, is trying to absurdly make this maximally great being a possibility. You're trying to take these irreconcilable differences in who the nature of this God is and trying to fix them. That's what theology spends most of its time trying to do, trying to figure out how to make this maximally great being make sense. And that's why I think it's kind of absurd. This argument is kind of absurd, and I think the exercise of theology is equally absurd in trying to prop it up. If I was the apologist, what would I do to fix it? Much like many of the arguments that I've said before, in this particular case, I would tell you to discard the ontological argument. I don't think it's salvageable. In fact, I would say probably 95% of apologists would agree with me on that this is kind of an absurd argument, and really it sounds good. It's an interesting mental exercise, but it's a great way for you to see the illustration of the begging the question fallacy, that we're assuming this thing exists in order to prove that it exists. I mean, every single premise has maximally great being in it. Okay, every single one of them. You're assuming everything in there, one at a time, all the time. I think the reason why William Lane Craig in his video blocks out the first one and says the rest of these nobody argues about is because he wants you to avoid the fact that he literally put maximally great being in every single premise and every single conclusion. And that really points to the idea of begging the question, that he's assuming to assume to assume, and it just goes right around in a circle. Yeah, toss it out, get rid of it. The ontological argument, I think, though, I will give it one thing. It has had a massive influence on how theology is done, because almost all of theology, from the nature of God to salvation to the kind of world that God has created, to his attributes from all-powerful to all-knowing to what it means for God to be moral and good in character have all been influenced by this argument. It's like theology's entire outline is trying to fix the problems of the ontological argument, or all the rest of the philosophical arguments for that matter. But this is the one that is easiest to see how theology does that. This is an absurd argument, and theology is absurd for trying to hold it up. Well, that's it for today. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. At present, we're at a high watermark for subscribers to the channel at 984. The watch hours are almost at 2,800. Now, for those, what do you want to know what that means? Well, we're almost a little over 200 watch hours away from memberships, super chat, all that stuff. Finding ways to fund this channel to keep me going, kind of fulfilling a dream of mine. And then we'll have another 1,000 watch hours to get ad revenue and that sort of thing. And that at that point, I think this this thing turns a corner for me. I also have a couple interviews coming up soon. One of those interviews is with the South African Atheist Republic. They asked to interview me. I don't know when they're going to air that interview, but I'm supposed to interview with them early October. And then Tim Mills, if you're familiar with his channel, where he talks to different people that have deconstructed. We originally tried to get this going about 2 years ago, but then I went into teaching and kind of backed off that interview. But sometime in early November, I'll be hopefully interviewing with him, and then he'll put that on his channel. So I got a couple of interviews in the works. I just wanted to announce that those are the ones that are in the works. Hopefully they'll work out. No guarantees, as always, with the internet and with life in general. So make sure you tune in for those if they drop. I'm also going to be dropping a couple extra bonus videos where I'm addressing the secular community in response to a address that Matt Dillahunty did via a video to one of the conventions. And there's a couple of things that he said in that video that struck with me, and I do want to lay those out as well. So thank you for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Make sure you're living your best life. You only get one go around, so make it a good one and make it a happy one if possible. Once again, appreciate you all. Like, share, subscribe, do the things that you YouTubers do. And I'll catch you next time.